Assalamu alaikum. Now we are going to talk about the posterior cranial fossa. This posterior cranial fossa is the largest fossa and the deepest fossa of these three fossas, and this posterior cranial fossa is the part that is going to lodge the hindbrain, and hindbrain includes cerebellum, which will be present here, and pons and medulla, which are going to be present in front, and then the spinal cord is going to extend through the foramen magnum. Alright, now the boundaries. The anterior boundary is going to be the posterior boundary of middle cranial fossa, which is formed by the superior border of the petrous part of the temporal bone and the dorsum celli. This is the anterior boundary of the posterior cranial fossa. The posterior boundary is formed by the squamous part of the temporal bone, occipital bone. All of this is the squamous part of the occipital bone. It forms the posterior boundary. Laterally, there are two bones. From the outside, if we can see that this is the parietal bone, the postero-inferior margin of the parietal bone is called the mastoid angle of parietal bone, and this is the mastoid part of the temporal bone. These two are going to form the lateral boundary. This part is going to be the part that is present at the postero-inferior angle of the parietal bone, and here is the part that is going to be present at the from this part. This is the part that is going to be the mastoid part of the temporal bone. Its floor is going to be formed by a median area and a lateral area. The median area is formed by this sloping area. This slope is formed by two bones. The posterior part of the sphenoid bone or the dorsum celli and the basilar part of the occipital bone. Both of these bones form this sloping area, which is called clivus. The foramen magnum is present in the middle, and the squamous part of the occipital bone is present behind. So three bones are present in the median area: the clivus, this sloping part, the foramen magnum, and the squamous part of the occipital bone. On the lateral side or the lateral areas is formed by this part called the condylar part of the occipital bone. If we look at the inferior surface, these are the occipital condyles. So this occipital condyle, when we look at the interior, this is the part, this is the condylar part of the occipital bone. After this is the posterior surface of the petrous part of temporal bone. This part, the posterior surface of petrous temporal, the mastoid temporal bone, and the mastoid angle of the temporal parietal bone. These four structures, the condylar part, posterior part of the petrous temporal, the mastoid part of temporal bone, and the mastoid angle of parietal bone, form the lateral area. Now, if we look closely at the median area, this clivus is formed by in front of the foramen magnum. This clivus is formed in front of foramen magnum and is formed by the fusion of the posterior part of the body of sphenoid and the basilar part of the occipital bone, or it is also called basi-occipit. It is related to the pons and medulla. The pons and medulla in the brain rest on this clivus, and the basilar plexus of veins is also present here. The foramen magnum is a large opening, the largest foramen of this brain, and this is lies in the floor of the fossa. The anterior part of the foramen is narrower as compared to the posterior part. This narrow anterior part is because of these occipital condyles. They overlap on the anterior part. After the foramen magnum is the squamous part of the temporal bone. This in the midline forms shows two or three structures. The main projection, this part, is called the internal occipital protuberance. This internal occipital protuberance is the part where the sinuses of the brains meet, and it is called the confluence of sinuses. It is related to the confluence of sinuses. On both sides of the eminence or protuberance, there are transverse sulcus that lodge the transverse sinus. From the internal occipital protuberance towards the foramen magnum extends a line which is called the internal occipital crest. This crest shaped structure which extends from the protuberance towards the occipital condyle is called the foramen magnum is called the internal occipital crest, and where it meets the foramen magnum, it forms a shallow fossa which is called vermian fossa. Now if we look at the transverse sulcus, they start near the confluence of sinuses. They move laterally and forwards on the squamous part of the temporal bone. The sulcus lodges the transverse sinus. These are the dural venous sinuses, which we'll talk about later. The transverse sulcus on the right side is deeper as compared to the left side, and it is continuous with the superior sagittal sulcus, which we saw in the vault. This is the start of the superior sagittal sulcus, and then it is going to move towards the vault. On the lateral side, this transverse sulcus, it continues into the sigmoid sulcus at the mastoid angle of the parietal bone. Now, on each side of this internal crest, these are the fossas which lodge the cerebellum of the brain. Now, if we look at the lateral area, this is the condylar part. This is the occipital condyle, and this is the condylar part of the occipital bone here. This condylar part of occipital bone is marked by a jugular tubercle. This part. This is a small projection. This is called the jugular tubercle. This is the projection on the other side. This jugular tubercle, behind it, almost we can say that postero-inferior to the jugular tubercle is a canal which is called the hypoglossal canal. This is the hypoglossal canal, and this hypoglossal canal, this part is the hypoglossal canal, and it is also called the anterior condylar canal, and it pierces the bone and runs obliquely forwards and laterally. After this condylar canal, we saw this jugular tubercle posterolateral to the jugular tubercle at the floor of the sigmoid sulcus. Here is another fossa. This is called the posterior condylar canal. This also is present just beneath the jugular foramen. This larger foramen is the jugular foramen, and on the floor of the jugular foramen, these are the posterior condylar canals. After these canals, we see the posterior surface of the petrous temporal bone. This has the internal acoustic meatus. This is the external acoustic meatus, and this part is the internal acoustic meatus. It is going to transmit the 7th and 8th vestibulocochlear nerve. So, internal acoustic meatus is present above the jugular foramen. This is the jugular foramen. It is present above the jugular foramen, and it is almost 1 centimeter long and runs almost transversely in the petrous temporal bone. Alright, after that there is an orifice for aqueduct of vestibule, which is a part of the internal ear, and we cannot see it on this bone. It forms a slit-like opening. There is then a subarcuate fossa. This is the arcuate eminence. Below this part is the subarcuate fossa, which is present behind the internal acoustic meatus. If we look at the jugular foramen, this is the inferior part of the jugular foramen. We will enter this here. This is the jugular foramen. This jugular foramen is present at the junction of the petrous temporal and the basilar part of the condylar part of the occipital bone. So this is the part where or we can say that it lies at the posterior end of the petro-occipital suture or fissure. This part, this jugular foramen, has a posterior margin and an anterior margin. The upper margin upper and lower margins, this upper margin has this projection. This projection is called glossopharyngeal notch. Lower margin जो है, it is smooth and regular. Now the mastoid part of the temporal bone. This is the mastoid part of temporal bone inside. The mastoid part of the temporal bone here. It has it forms the lateral wall of the posterior cranial fossa, and it is present posterior to the petrous temporal bone. Anteriorly, it is marked by this sulcus, which is called the sigmoid sulcus. It begins as a continuation of the transverse sulcus. This was a transverse sulcus. It begins as the continuation of transverse sulcus and ends at the jugular foramen. So this the transverse sulcus lodges the transverse sinus. Transverse sinus is continued towards the sigmoid sinus, and the sigmoid sinus at the jugular foramen, it continues as internal jugular vein, and it is going to move downwards. After this, there is the tympanic, and this mastoid part has this mastoid foramen. This mastoid foramen opens at the upper part of the sigmoid sulcus, but we cannot see it here. So this was all about the posterior cranial fossa. We have seen all these three fossas and their important landmarks.